Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar sponsored by the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, marking 20 years of Roper v. Simmons and redrawing the line. My name is Kristen Houlet-Cuellar, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. I want to thank you all for taking time to join us this evening for this important conversation. 20 years ago, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Roper versus Simmons that the death penalty for individuals under age 18 at the time of the crime is unconstitutional due to the diminished culpability of developing adults. I remember the morning of March 1st, 2005 very clearly. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, working for the human rights organization Amnesty International and their program to abolish the death penalty. And we had played a leading role in the campaign to end the juvenile death penalty. The U.S. Supreme Court decisions usually come out around 10 a.m., and we were overjoyed when Roper was released. It was a tradition in our office to go to the intercom at the front desk to announce big moments, and I was so happy to make that announcement and to hear the whoops of joy from my colleagues throughout the halls. It was also a bittersweet moment, however, because we had lost so many people who should have been saved by the Roper decision. This 5-4 landmark decision, again, found that executing juveniles violates the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution and the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Prior to this decision, 22 juveniles had been executed nationally between 1977 and March 1st, 2005. Texas alone accounted for 13 of those executions, putting to death people who were 17 years old at the time of the crime. And that includes 3 people put to death less than 2 years before the United States Supreme Court agreed to take the case of Roper v. Simmons. The Roper decision, however, spared the lives of 72 people nationwide who are still on death row, and including 29 people in Texas who have been sentenced to death for crimes they were convicted of committing when they were 17 years old. Yet the same reasons cited in the Roper decision, including lack of maturity or impulse control, apply to another group of individuals who should be exempt from the death penalty, those ages 18 to 20 at the time of the crime. New evidence suggests that the brain does not finish developing until an individual reaches their early 20s or early to mid 20s. And yet, since March 1st, 2005, Texas has executed 61 people who are 18, 19, or 20 at the time of the crime for which they were convicted. Of these 61, 46 were people of color. And today, there are still 33 people on death row in Texas for crimes committed under 21 years of age. 16 of those 33 sentences given to young adults are from Harris County alone. In the Roper decision, the lead author, former Justice Anthony Kennedy, admitted that moving the age of culpability to 18 was an arbitrary line. He wrote, quote, "Drawing the line at 18 years of age is subject, of course, to the objections always raised against categorical rules. The qualities that distinguish juveniles from adults do not disappear when an individual turns 18. By the same token, some under 18 have already attained a level of maturity some adults will never reach. For the reasons we have discussed, however, a line must be drawn. Tonight, we want to talk about redrawing that line. Legislation has been filed in the Texas legislature, House Bill 2055, which seeks to raise the age at which the death penalty can be applied. It is based on the defendant's age at the time of the offense. Under the bill, life imprisonment would be the maximum sentence for capital defendants under 21 at the time of the crime. And we'll be talking more about that later. Tonight, we are so honored to be joined by attorneys, professors, students, and friends of late adolescents who have been sentenced to death or executed by the state of Texas. They will shed light on the unique experiences and the reasons why they believe individuals in this age category should not be eligible for the death penalty. We're going to start with Richard Burr, Bill Bush, and Lana, if y'all want to turn your cameras on. Okay, so Richard, let's start with you. Attorney Richard Burr has devoted his practice entirely to death penalty defense work since 1977 and has represented countless people facing execution in Texas. You represented Billy Joe Wardlow, who was sentenced to death in 1995 for a crime he committed when he was 18 years old. Billy spent the next 25 years on death row before he was executed by Texas on July 8th, 2020. In a letter to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, Billy wrote, "I came to death row a scared boy who made poor choices. I will leave death row a man that others admire because I weathered the storms of life with the help of people that loved me. We should all be so fortunate." Can you please tell us about Billy and the person he became as he grew up on death row?
Like you've read from Billy's statement, he was a scared kid when he came to death row. He'd heard all kinds of terrible stories about death row. When he first went on the recreation yard, he was approached by some young black men to play basketball. And he was scared, and he, reacted hostilely when they asked him what was up, and they said, "Hey, cool off, cool off." And from that point forward, he began to realize that he had a lot to learn. From that same letter, he said, "When I was sentenced to death and sent to death row, I was only beginning to work through my past and overcome the issues that plagued me. Death row was both a help and a hindrance. Despite myself, I made friends, and I realized that it was okay to rely on someone because everyone isn't out to get you or is going to betray your trust. I thought they would up to that point. The two people I was closest to, his mother and father, had betrayed the trust he put in them. And it was a relief to see that people sentenced to death, the so-called worst of the worst, could actually rise above my expectations and the world's and teach me what I wouldn't learn at home." From the time Billy got onto death row in 1995 to the time he was executed in 2020, he matured. His brain matured, his character matured. He became an extraordinary human being. From that scared kid, he turned into something that a fellow death row inmate described in the following terms. He shares his special commissary care packages from people on the outside with others on the row. He takes it on himself to keep the showers we all use clean, not because he is assigned to do this, but because those assigned to do it usually only halfway do it. He humbles himself enough to scrub the showers and does it regularly, even though there is no reward in doing so. He's not a troublemaker and uses titles of respect like sir and ma'am. Once, when I had an execution date and was moved, I left all my Dungeons and Dragons game books with him. When I got a stay, he returned the books within a day or two. That's just how Billy is. Billy Wardlow matured into a brilliant man. He could have been an engineer or science, a physicist, but he also had an enormous heart. And he demonstrated that through the arc of his life. By the time he was executed, he was one of the most beloved people ever to be on death row in Texas. Guards cared about him tremendously. Many inmates, any inmate who knew him cared about him. The thing that was probably the most remarkable was he figured out a way how people could modify their radios a little bit on death row and talk to each other. And they were then able to play Dungeons and Dragons with each other from their own cells. And he moderated those games. He always set out a course for each person that would sort of challenge that person to become a better person in the course of the game. All of this is documented in a wonderful article in the New York Times Magazine a couple of years ago called Dungeons and Dragons on Death Row. That was Billy Wardlow. What was remarkable is his life demonstrated in spades exactly what neuroscience showed after the Roper decision. Two things mainly. First, the unformed character of 18-year-olds continues to develop as the brain develops. And second, that there's absolutely no appreciable difference between a 17-year-old, an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old, and a 20-year-old in terms of brain development and character formation. What's critical about that is that in Texas, the single most important issue that the jury has to answer in the penalty phase is whether the person is likely to be dangerous in the future. And to make that assessment for an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old whose brain is still developing and whose character is as yet not fully formed is absurd. It is not only arbitrary, it's crazy. It makes no sense because you cannot make any judgment about anybody's future conduct if you don't know who they are now. And there's no way to know who an 18, 19, or 20-year-old is now in terms of moral development and character formation. We argued that on behalf of Billy in 2020. It fell on deaf ears in both the courts and the Pardon and Parole Board. We got one vote for Billy in the Pardon and Parole Board. We did have 68, I think, legislators sign a letter to the Pardon and Parole Board asking them to grant clemency or at least grant a reprieve long enough for the legislature to consider this issue. And they, of course, didn't. But that really is Billy's life trajectory shows in very, very concrete terms how you cannot make a judgment about an 18-year-old and how that person's character and life will develop. It's impossible. And Billy's, trajectory showed that in spades.
Great, thank you so much. And we have dropped the link to that article about the Dungeons and Dragons in the chat. So really encourage people to read that. It's really wonderful. Next, we're going to hear from Lana Ziegert, who was introduced to Billy through her father and corresponded with him for 12 years. Lana recently graduated from Rowan University with a bachelor's in psychology and is currently applying to law schools. Lana, what did you learn about the capacity for change and growth in your own life and in Billy's through your 12-year correspondence, which I understand began when you were just 7? And what do you want people to know about Billy?
Yes, I started writing to Billy long before I was even really aware of why he was on death row or even where he was. To me, I was always just referring to him as Uncle Billy, my dad's friend. And Billy often tried to kind of just protect me from his past for a while, just so that we could have a playful, fun relationship. But once I did learn why he was there, it only really made me respect him more, because the Billy that I knew had completely adapted to this completely different world that I couldn't even wrap my head around. He would write to me about how he would use his non-dominant hand to do simple tasks like brush his teeth and brush his hair, because he read that it would help his brain develop new neurological pathways and it would make his days more interesting. And he would remember that I became obsessed with killer whales in SeaWorld, so he started researching animals in captivity. And he knew that my dad was an investigative journalist investigating climate change, so Billy decided to take it upon himself to become his own expert in climate change. Like the Billy that I knew never really settled. He didn't waste his life away, and probably what many other people would believe to be a worst case scenario. He spent his time reading and educating himself and creating artwork and writing poems. So, if there's one thing that I often tell people about Billy, is that it would really just take one letter to change your mind from him in one conversation. The man that I knew, the Billy I knew, was for sure not the boy that committed the crime that put him behind bars. He was a selfless man that never missed a birthday, that always sent a card, and always even took the time to make intricate drawings of horses in his letters in between, like, the words that he wrote me. So yeah, I think the one thing that Billy taught me was there's no excuse to waste time. There's no excuse to be ignorant. That's exactly why I want to go to law school and become a lawyer, is to fight for the underprivileged that might not always have the resources. And yeah, and there's no excuse to not better yourself, because somehow he was able to find his own purpose in his situation that he was in. And yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Lana, and thank you, Richard, for sharing your personal reflections on your friend Billy. We're now going to turn to Dr. William Bush, who's a professor of history at Texas A&M University in San Antonio, where he has taught classes since 2008. And he's conducted extensive research on the topic of juveniles and late adolescents and the death penalty. Professor Bush, in an op-ed that you authored about Billy Joe Wardlow, you wrote about how prosecutors use the terms predator, an animal out in the wild, and stone cold killer to describe him so that the jury would consider him a future danger, which, as Dick has said, is a requirement for the imposition of the death penalty in Texas. And yet that prediction was false. Billy was a model inmate. According to your research, how common is it for prosecutors to use this kind of language in referring to late adolescents charged with committing capital crimes?
Hi, Kristen. Thanks for having me. And the answer is that it is all too common. I have looked at 82 cases between the reinstatement of the death penalty in Texas in the 1970s and the Roper decision in 2005. And there's definitely a pattern that you see of this kind of rhetoric and argumentation. I could quote from several different cases, but what I want to do instead is point out how this rhetoric would accompany a minimization of what today we would call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So as the prosecution is making the closing argument in the sentencing proceeding and describing the person in these types of really, terrible terms, they're also very often minimizing traumatic experiences that the individual had, sometimes in early childhood all the way up through adolescence. To take another recent case where it's kind of an extreme example of it, the case of Ramiro Gonzalez, who was executed last summer. He was convicted of a murder just weeks after his 18th birthday. And during his sentencing proceeding, the prosecution described the home environment that he grew up in as sort of very loving and caring on a ranch. But in fact, he experienced nonstop physical, sexual, and psychological abuse from early childhood. He grew up amongst family members who had substance abuse issues with high rates of suicide. And it was just very misleading and dishonest portrayal. Even the state's own expert witness, who described him as an antisocial personality on the basis of that testimony in 2006, recanted his testimony later, based partly on this additional evidence of ACEs, but also based on the same dynamic that you all just described so eloquently about Billy Joe Wardlow, which was that he grew and matured and transformed while on death row and became a very caring person and very remorseful as well. So the extreme rhetoric often is accompanied by kind of its mirror image, which is this sort of eliding or minimizing of what should be mitigating evidence. It's especially also noteworthy in cases where the individual has spent time in the state's juvenile justice system, which is something else that I've studied. There have been at least a dozen cases since 2000 that the Marshall Project found of individuals who spent years in youth lockups where violence and abuse were commonplace. And then this gets described later during the sentencing phase of that individual's capital trial as examples of the state attempting to help the person and as evidence that the person is unreformable, right? That they are a future danger. So there are many levels to this kind of rhetoric that I wanted to point out.
Thank you so much for that. And could you explain the neuroscientific and psychological factors that make the 18 to 20 age group distinct in terms of culpability and their potential for rehabilitation compared with older adults?
I'll do my best.
I know
With the
history.
with the caveat that I'm a historian and
Yeah.
not a psychiatrist. But certainly this research really began to come to the fore in the 1990s, the so-called teenage brain research that discovered that key regions of the brain that controlled sort of future planning, thinking about consequences, were still developing in late adolescence, where previously it had been believed that they were fully formed at a much earlier age. And in some ways it validated the beliefs of developmental psychologists and sort of child experts in the early 20th century at the dawn of the creation of a separate justice system for juveniles. And there were those in the early 20th century who argued that 18 to 20-year-olds should also be separated from adult consequences in the system as well. In fact, the law that created the Texas Youth Council, which later became the Texas Youth Commission, which today is the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, was based on a model law that was created in the 1930s specifically for 18 to 20-year-olds. And then that group kind of fell off and it became just focused on what we think of as legal juveniles under 18 today. So in some ways, the scientific knowledge that we have today is not as new as we think it is in some ways.
Great, thank you so much. Dick, I want to go back to you just for a minute. In addition to the legislators and others who provided support for Billy, I remember that I think there were at least 2 members of the jury that sentenced him to death who supported at least a reprieve or possible commutation of a sentence. Could you talk a little bit about what was persuasive to them and what they told you they wish they had known at the time that they sentenced Billy to death? Oh, you're still on mute there, actually.
Thank you. We contacted most of the living members of Billy's jury and found that 2 were quite interested in Billy's history on death row. And I think that was the thing that moved them the most. We also let them know about the evolution of neuroscience. I didn't know back then, Billy, that there'd been a model for this in the 1920s and 30s in Texas. That would have been helpful to know, but probably wouldn't have mattered. But anyway, these 2 jurors were quite moved, and they wrote their own letters. I usually write letters for people, but they wrote their letters. They were quite moving letters, saying that they wish they'd known then about the brain of an 18-year-old and what was unformed about it, and that they could see by virtue of Billy's life that they were absolutely wrong in what they all agreed on about future dangerousness, and they regretted it tremendously. One of the jurors had actually done his own research. He was a social worker, I think, and he had already, when we found him, he already knew, what we knew, and they both wrote very strong letters to the Pardon and Parole Board. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much.
I was just going to say, Kristen, it often happens that jurors regret their decision, not just in cases involving 18-year-olds, but involving a lot of different circumstances. And not once has the Texas Pardon and Parole Board been moved by that. Not once.
Yeah, it's a farce of an agency in that sense. So thank you all so much for sharing these reflections and these knowledge and experience in this topic. We are now going to move on to our next slate of panelists. So I'm going to swap you all around. Okay, great. Oops, sorry. I'm writing. Okay, great. So we're going to hear from 3 people who have worked with and learned from Obie Weathers through a variety of youth mentorship, educational, and artistic programs. Obie has been on death row in Texas since 2001. He was 18 when he was charged with capital murder in San Antonio. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our session, he is one of the 33 people in the age 18 to 20 category still on death row. We are eager to learn about the programs involving Obie and the impact they have had. So let's start with you, Ryan. You're currently pursuing your PhD with a focus on social justice and systemic reform, and have worked to restore the Credible Messengers movement to its original intent. Tell us, what is the Credible Messengers movement and how has Obie served as a credible messenger?
So the Credible Messengers movement was founded by Ellis. It was back in the 1969, right around there, 70s, and then into the 80s. But Ellis was a former Black Panther, and it was in the Bronx where he recognized that folks coming home from prison had influence inside the neighborhood with the neighborhood youth. And so he started to ask these individuals that had this major influence with the youth to help them become influenced by doing positive things and supporting the Black Panthers programs and feeding and all the different things that they were doing. And so they came on board and they did that. And they, Ellis coined them as credible messengers. And since it's evolved, and like a lot of the programs that the Black Panthers had created, a lot of them were co-opted by the state, and turned into a source of funding for the state. And the Credible Messengers movement went that direction as well. And so what we're bringing back is to its original intent, which credible messengers have lived experience. And they have a connection that's deep with the individuals that they serve, right? So a lot of folks, that are involved in gangs, they're more impacted and influenced by other individuals that were involved in gangs. So that credible message comes from those types of individuals, and so a lot of these programs that exist in our communities don't have credible messengers with that lived experience. A lot of people have produced careers for themselves, and so we've been working with Obie since 2019. We were introduced to Lawrence, who told us about Obie and told us about Christopher Young. Christopher Young, a very amazing individual with a lot of influence that used his lived experience to influence transformation within the juveniles that he was writing and that he was mentoring. And so he became this mentor. And so that's what a credible messenger is they become mentors, and they help guide individuals from their communities that they come from, away from, the destruction, away from the self-destruction, and away from the traps that exist in the community that are trapping all of our folks and legitimizing the system and pipelining them into prison, into juvenile hall. And so Christopher Young was best friends with Obie. Unfortunately, the state, pursued to execute Christopher Young. So we'll take a moment of silence for Christopher Young. so Christopher Young wanted to continue to mentor the youth that he served. And he said, Obi, I need somebody to carry this on. And so we were, grateful that the universe brought us to Obi through Lawrence Thrush. And so Lawrence told us about Obi. And so we started to learn about his origami and his art. And he was writing letters with an organization in Santa Barbara. And so we jumped on board with writing those letters with Obi and the youth that we were serving through our Credible Messengers Alternatives to Violence program. And so we were working with Santa Barbara Alternatives to Violence, and we started to do this letter exchange, and it just kept evolving. And we became really close with Obi. And then I was the one that told him, you're a credible messenger. And just because you're incarcerated doesn't mean that you don't have influence to transform and change your community. And so I told him about the Credible Messengers work, and I sent him papers because I was writing up papers, and I was looking at and researching this incarcerated Credible Messengers. And so what I studied was Christopher Young and his influence and his transformation that he engaged with youth, and the letters and all the different impact statements that they made, right? And then I started to study Obi's impact, and I've been studying it, I'm in my PhD and I'm continuing to study it. But now I'm over here at UC Irvine in my PhD. And so we brought this program into the juvenile hall here in Orange County in Tango unit. And we started to write letters back and forth with Obi. And then we had Lawrence come in and share Obi's book. And so he has this book of all his poetry and all this art and all these amazing things, and letters from, some of his classes that he's been teaching inside the universities, and just all these different things. And they became inspired. And so they said, let's create a book with Obi. And so we've been creating this book, and they've wrote up the chapters that they wanted, and they titled it False Labels. And so I'll share a little bit of that book real quick. Let me see here. Let me see. Let me go right here real quick, and I'll pull it up. Excuse me real quick. Here we go. So can you all see that? Awesome. Okay, so we created this book with Obi, and it's with the youth in Tango unit. A lot of the youth in Tango unit, they're 18 to 26-year-olds. They're looking at life sentences. A lot of them are looking at going into the adult system, but they're still in the juvenile system currently. So they're waiting for their 707 hearings. And so we've been going in here doing our Credible Messengers Creative Arts program, where we use creative writing and art as a way to rehabilitate these youth and work with them as credible messengers, using our lived experience to impact transformation. And so Obi came on, and he started to work with them through our letter writing, and he'd been writing tons of messages to these youth, and they've been writing him back and forth. And so we captured that, and then we captured their art and we captured their poetry. But this was inspired by Obi's book that he created himself. And so it's called False Labels. And so I'll go down and show you some of the art. So we've been doing all these art pieces with them. So this is us in there. This is our first Credible Messengers certification graduation, where we celebrated and we had folks come in and we certified them as credible messengers, and they've completed their first phase as a credible messenger. And so if you go through the false labels, and then this is some of the graduation of pictures, and then this is, the beginnings of it. But there's Obi, and this is a letter that he wrote to them. Peace to the homies in Tango unit. I hope you all got y'all heads up and focused on making the best moves for yourselves and for your futures. I loved reading what a couple of y'all wrote and hearing of your idea for a book. It sounds cool, and I'm down to work with you all on it. So it's like this back and forth engagement. And this is really transforming these youth that we serve in there. So this is some of it, and the book's gonna come out, and we'll be sure, when it does come out, to get you all a copy. Right now we're just really finalizing it. This is some of the work that we were doing out there in Santa Barbara, and these were some of the youth that we were working with Obi out there as well. And we talk about labeling theory, and that's been coming up, the labeling of individuals as monsters. And when I was a youngster, they called us super predators, and they were calling us all super predators and locking us up in juvenile halls and camps and YA. And so we're really breaking that down, like these labels and the impacts that they have, labeling individuals as gang members. So labeled delinquent. This is poetry from one of our youth in there. And so this just gives you a look at what we've been up to with Obi. And Obi's really impacting transformation. And I'm happy to share this story with you and share. We go as credible messengers and testify at the 707 hearings for these youth. We've testified as expert credible messengers on rehabilitation and have testified for about 7 youth. We've gotten 6 of those youth to stay in juvenile. We've only lost 1 case, but he's doing an appeal on that, and we hope to win it on the next round. I'm happy to say that one of those youngsters, he got out. He's at UC Berkeley now. He was looking at a life sentence as an adult. He was tried as a juvenile. And so all these classes and workshops that we do are all tailored towards rehabilitation. And we document all of these workshops and the impact that they're having, and the rehabilitation that's taking place within these youth's minds, and how we're transforming and rehabilitating them and teaching them positive growth and positive forward motion, and transforming their whole entire destiny through this work. So another youth, he got out. He was facing a really double life sentence, and he got out. He's doing amazing, working, about to become a firefighter. So there's success stories behind this work, and a lot of these youth really learn from Obi, and Obi's really had this big transformation where they see, hey, like, I have a chance to fight and maybe get home, and Obi has been doing, a lot. So yeah, that's a little bit about the work we've been doing, and I'll pass it on from there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ryan. It's really fascinating. We're now going to hear from Dr. Roy. Thank you so much for being here tonight. You're the director and co-founder of California State University, Los Angeles Prison Graduation Initiative, the first in-prison degree program in California, as well as the founder of Words Uncaged. Can you tell us about Words Uncaged and the work that you've been doing with Obi and the impact it has had?
Absolutely. And also, Ryan mentioned a book that was the inspiration, I think, and I think he's referring to Buddhas on Death Row, which is the book that we worked on with Obi. So it's a good segue. I did want to just start by kind of, I guess, contextualizing Words Uncaged and the experience of it. And it's great to see Nikia here, by the way, who was in that class and worked on the book. In a way, Words Uncaged is more like credible messages in Ryan's kind of reimagining or reconnection of it to its original roots, where Words Uncaged, we don't have any, it's not really connected to the institution in a formal way. It's more informal. So it gives us a lot more freedom. We don't have to go through the same kind of bureaucracy that I do with my regular job as the director of the Prison Graduation Initiative. But I think they're both important, but they kind of work in different ways. And with the Prison Graduation Initiative, we're in a bunch of different prisons around California now, and we're going to be starting at San Quentin fairly soon. And why I bring that up is because I go to prisons all through California all the time as part that's what my job is. So for the last sort of 12 years or so, I've spent a lot of time, at least I would say 8 hours or so a week, in a different prison in California. And I have seen, I was just up at CCWF, which is the women's prison in Chowchilla in California, as part of a group and a program that was working with officers from that facility, taking them to Norway. And their project was closing down the death row there, which at the time was the only women's death row in California. And of course, at San Quentin, which, another well-known prison with a significant death row at one time, both those death rows have been closed down. And California is moving towards what they're calling the California model. Now, as imperfect as that is, and I'm not going to suggest everything's great in California in the prison system, it isn't. But it is a stark contrast to what we're talking about here from Texas. And I say that because with Words Uncaged, we started working with Obi. And, at first, I think I was a little bit naive, where part of the thought was we were going to produce this book that we would get to the correct people in Texas and in different places that had the power to spare his life and to, if not commute him and release him, at least allow him a life without parole sentence in Texas. And, after spending some time in Texas and going to death row with Lawrence, who was mentioned by Ryan, and working on this project, it changed what the project was. The idea behind it to start with was to really kind of, again, I think naively, do what we did in California, which in California, a lot of people from the books we'd produced that we'd got to governors and different people had their sentences commuted, that had life without parole sentences or on death row. And that model became pretty quickly, we understood, okay, this is something different we're doing here. And so it became different. And I think for all of us working on the project here, it was sobering in the worst kind of way to realize it isn't always about, it gave us a more expansive view of the work, I should say. And so the book was called Buddha's on Death Row. And what connected me, first of all, with Obi through Lawrence was Buddhism. I've been practicing Buddhist most of my life. And I've spent a lot of time in India, where my parents are from, in Buddhist spaces. And so that was our initial connection. And the book was really around this phrase that Obi had used about Buddhas on death row. And I first met Obi during the pandemic, and we started corresponding about Buddhism. And it really kind of made me, he really challenged me, not in a direct way, but his context of we can talk about death, we can talk about releasing ourselves from attachment, we can talk about compassion, but to talk about it on death row, it's a whole nother level of, okay, you've really got to be real to do this kind of stuff and to think in that kind of way. So I learned a lot from that, just on a kind of individualistic, selfish level in that way. And my perception of Buddhism expanded from that, even after all these years of practice. And so we were just kind of coming out of the pandemic, and it was the last class I taught as a professor, actually, before I became a full-time administrator at the university. And Nikia was in the class, and it was a kind of special time because it was the first class back from the pandemic. And it was also the last class I ever taught. Well, not ever, I shouldn't say that, but until now. And out of that came this really wonderful book that really, I'm not just proud of it as a artifact, as a finished product, but the process around it was pretty magical. Considering the conditions that it was being written under. And Nakia will talk about it, you know, in a minute, but from the student perspective. But I still get emails now from students who just said, you know, I was thinking about that class. It's the most impactful class I've ever had. And I know it wasn't anything to do with what I was doing. It was this kind of magic that was happening around those themes and around what Obi was really bringing and his presence. And one of the things that there's kind of was a sort of fundamental takeaway from me for it is I know I was listening with a lot of interest to the early discussion about the context of Texas and the history from Bill and Richard and Lana. And one of, you know, the framing of justice and the framing of the death penalty in Texas and in the US and in the West is very much around a kind of retribution and, you know, a sentence of like, well, how much punishment is enough punishment? And everything's kind of framed within that sort of those parameters that to me are very limiting. When you think about the death penalty in the context of Buddhism, it's a very different kind of set of criteria and a different set of values. So what we really sort of engaged with was the concept of compassion. And that meant not just for Obi, but for Obi's victims. And Obi sent out meditations on that and the recognition of the harm that was caused and these ripple effects of pain that go on. And when you think about it in that way, what is the way to stop that rippling of pain continuing? Is it by killing someone on death row and you know, I don't think so. I mean, I'm pretty sure that that's not the case. And so that gives you a different entry to think about the death penalty, I think, and to think about Obi's context and not to separate those that have been harmed by those that have done the harm and to recognize that they'd also been harmed as well. And we're just in this kind of perpetual cycle. And then I think the other thing that came from it was really understanding, trying to understand why someone did what they did instead of demonize them, as was mentioned earlier with Ryan, with the labels and things like that. And it doesn't mean you get rid of accountability. It doesn't mean any of those kind of things that I think are the stereotypes of this, or you're soft on crime, or all these other things I hear. But it gives you a much more a deeper reckoning with these kind of things, the effects of actions, certain actions, and you know, in my opinion, that is how to prevent this kind of wheel of karma turning, or this endless production of suffering. So I think that's how we met. That's the class, and I know we have Nakia here, so I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that, Nakia.
Yeah, please do, Nakia. As a student, you've participated in classes with Obi, so tell us about that experience and what you've learned from Obi.
I actually think about one particular woman when I'm reflecting on our time with Obi in the classroom. She began the semester fairly closed off and pretty rigid in her belief systems of what justice is and isn't. As the semester progressed, she began to open up and actually became quite active in community work. And by the end of the semester, she wrote a poem about Obi. And mind you, she had never tried to write a poem in her 38 years of living, but she did so beautifully. And it was about how conversations with him led her to perceive herself and the world around her in an entirely new light. And she thanked Obi for because her compassion and her empathy and self-love and love for others grew in a way that she did not know was necessary or possible. And so that is just one of many students that Obi has connected with. And many of his students realize that there is a lot to learn from other people's mistakes, and even more so from what they've done to grow apart from the person that they once were towards the person that they would like to be. As human beings, we're meant to grow and change. I know that from Obi's life experience, and I know that from my own life experience. I know that I'm thankful that I'm not the same person I was at 18 years old. So Obi dedicates his time to foster hope and a better future where we take care of each other, and he encourages others to do the same. Just by being the person that Obi is today, he provides a safe space and promotes positive change in the mindsets of those he interacts with, and he encourages the best in all of us. Obi once wrote to me that he hopes that I can use the thoughts that terrify me the most to make myself more skillful, loving, and wise. And since receiving that letter, every single time I wonder whether I can push forward, I think back to those words and I'm able to pull myself back up from my feet and continue on. So I've learned a lot from Obi.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you all for sharing with us about your experiences with Obi. I think we're all very excited to be able to access the books and they come out. I wanted to invite Lana, Dick, and Professor Bush to come back on camera. I have one kind of last question for anyone who wants to answer, which is, if you could sit down with Texas lawmakers, what's the one thing you'd want to tell them about the death penalty and late adolescence and why they should support House Bill 2055? Anyone want to go first? Just jump in.
I'll be glad to
Go ahead.
start.
Go ahead, Zach.
The central question before any capital jury in Texas is whether this person will be a danger in the future. And it is not only common sense that you cannot make that judgment about an 18-year-old, but now there is a whole world of science, and according to Bill Bush, a world of history that supports that judgment. And it does seem to me that if we could bring history of Texas in particular and of science in the evolution since 2005 and Roper, and some of the experts who have evolved that science, several of whom are in Texas, to the legislature, I think we'd make a very compelling argument.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? If you could have 30 seconds with a Texas legislator, what would you say?
I would say I'm feeling argumentative. So I would say that the state should be careful about its own culpability in some of these cases. It is a state institution that inflicted some of the damage on some of these individuals. And I keep waiting for the day when a victim's family files a civil suit against the state of Texas. I mean, it feels to me like it's a matter of time. So if I were a legislator considering this bill, I would have the state's own culpability in many of these cases in mind.
Yeah.
I'll jump in really quick, but I think I would just ask, who are you trying to punish? Because for the majority of the cases, I mean, that person's going to be in prison for at minimum a decade before they even get executed. That person that you're executing is not going to be the person that was originally sentenced anyway. So what's the actual goal and who are you actually trying to punish? And I know that Billy did not deserve to be executed, and unfortunately his case is not unique. And there are many other Billies out there, and I think I would just remind them of that.
Love that, Anna. Thank you. Any of our California friends? I'm sure there's a lot you'd want to say to Texas
I think we'll
legislators.
feel scared about saying anything to Texas. I mean, I'm brown and got a British accent, so I don't think they'd listen to me. But I think what I'd say is, compassion is not just a Buddhist value. And, a lot of, death row and how we treat vulnerable people, no matter what someone's done, is in conflict, I think, with our values as a country, as I see it, and with Christian values, if you happen to be Christian as well. And so I think you know, by the death penalty doesn't just harm the people that are on death row. It really sort of harms us as a nation in our spirit and in our values.
So much. Ryan, did you want to jump in?
Yes. You know, I mean, 2055, like here in California, we've done so much to change the juvenile lifer laws. A lot of my friends were spending the rest of their lives in prison, and a lot of them are home today doing community service, you know, impacting change, working with the youth, working with the foster youth, working in juvenile facilities. A lot of them are home going to college. But that was because the laws changed for juveniles in the state of California. And so if the state of California has had this much success shifting their laws away from giving juveniles from the age of 18 to 25 life sentences, then there's no reason why Texas can't do the same with giving individuals that are serving death sentences over there that same recognition. The state of California transformed a lot, and I'm happy to say that a lot of the community transformation that the state of California has experienced is because these people are now home in their communities, serving their communities. And so I hope that that the state of Texas and the policymakers will really take a deep look at other states that have successfully done this and see that it has to happen for their state too.
Thank you all so much. That's very eloquent. I wish you could be with me to walk the halls in the state capitol, but we really appreciate that. I'm going to now ask Nakia to read something that Obi wrote specifically for our gathering tonight. Nakia?
Thank you. Here at Pulaski Unit, where people condemned to death are housed, there is a band. It is made up of guys from the general population of the prison. They walk from cell block to cell block, playing instruments, performing covers. This morning, they performed Used to Be Young by Miley Cyrus. I hadn't heard it before, but I know that many of the people listening with me in their cells could relate. So many of us are now men in our 40s and 50s who found ourselves washed up at the gates of death row during the turbulent years of our youth. A number of us had some of the worst days of our lives in our teens. Our choices, our actions as teens, have left deep pain in our fellow citizens of the state and the country, but also ourselves. And I would know. Half of the death row population, including myself, have either completed or are currently enrolled in a faith-based rehabilitation program. Many of the classes during the years-long program involve discussions where I often listen to my peers share not merely their remorse for the harms they caused, but I've listened to them articulate clearly what led them to become the people who made their horrible choices. Surprisingly, I never heard anyone mention late adolescence as a factor. For a time, I thought it was all due to a lack of information, till I realized that what I was looking at in their testimonies were men who have taken full responsibility for their lives, past, present, and future. However, if I pressed them with the fact that impulsivity is a feature of a brain yet fully developed, they'd concede, asserting that everyone is stupid when they're young. But they'd invariably conclude that they knew right from wrong when they made the regrettable choices. This steadfast sense of personal responsibility, which characterizes many of the men who committed terrible acts in their teens, is what I witnessed them passing on to other inmates they come in contact with. New arrivals to death row and young inmates who serve our meals, clean the cell blocks, and pass out laundry. I see in their patience with young new arrivals a mercy born of personal experience. They know what it's like to be young, dumb, and often traumatized. And I witness this merciful patience making a difference in the prison culture. Death row is perhaps the most well-behaved area in the prison. Guards love to work this area as well as inmate workers. Both find it a respite from the usual, often madhouse that a prison can be. Many young men have personally thanked me for mentoring them in brief moments as they pushed a broom down the walkway in front of my cell. The most memorable was a young man who told me once that I saved his life, that my words helped him redirect his life by ushering him through the chaos of youth. He was now about to be released on parole and wanted me to know that he was grateful for my guiding him into a bright, healthy, and sober future. Many of my surviving peers who were sentenced to death during late adolescence have had similar experiences, which in my mind calls into question the notion that we would be a continuing threat to the safety of others. We understand that it looked that way in the past, but like Miley sings, it is because we used to be young.
Thank you, Nikia, and thank you so much to Obi for writing those remarks for us tonight. I really appreciated Ryan calling out Christopher Young and the moment of silence that we held for Christopher. And so what we want to close tonight is with another moment of silence. I'm going to share our dedication slides. These are the 61 men who have been executed by the state of Texas in the last 20 years, who were 18, 19, or 20 years old at the time of the crime. We also acknowledge Terrence Andrus, a young man who sadly and very tragically took his own life while on death row, and who case is very much along the lines of what Dr. Bush described in terms of the state's culpability. So thank you so much to all of you for sharing with us tonight. We look forward to staying in touch with you and to hearing what is next with Obi and his work. And we will certainly be in touch with those of you in Texas about House Bill 2055 and how that progresses in the Texas legislature. But thank you so much for being with us tonight and for being part of this important conversation. And I wish you a good rest of your evening. Thank you.